Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program, Blueprint for Establishing Zero Trust in Your Federal Agency. We're excited to bring this content to you today as agencies navigate the basics of building a zero trust infrastructure. I'm James Hansen, Group Publisher of Federal and Technology Markets here at GovExec. There has been a massive shift to remote working, along with an increased level of advanced threats to national security. Government agencies and the contractors who serve those agencies need an effective strategy to manage access to secure data. The plan and practice around zero trust requires thinking through several different considerations. Today, we'll cover this and more. To start the program, we have the pleasure of talking to John Sims on the importance of zero trust in government agencies. John is the Senior Technical Advisor in the Office of the CTO with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. John, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, James. Glad to be here.
To begin, John, do you mind just sharing with our audience a little bit about your background and your role at CISA?
Sure. So I've been in federal IT for about 25 years. I came over to DHS from the Food and Drug Administration, where I served as the Chief Information Security Officer, and really came to DHS in 2013 to support the CDM program because I saw a lot of value in what DHS was trying to do with CDM in the early days, and wanted to be part of that. Over the past couple of years, I've supported the High Value Asset Program, as well as serving as a security architect for the TIC program that has kind of led me into cloud and zero trust. So that's in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for your service and support on today's program. Let's start with establishing a baseline. I feel like there's still a lot of education that needs to take place around zero trust, that it's not just a tool in a box that you can buy, but it really is a journey. Can you tell our audience, what does zero trust mean to you, and why is it so important for agencies?
Well, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One really important reason is that we've been using the perimeter-based security model for the past, I would say, 25 years. And if we look at it from the 1999 perspective of where agencies were, they were still very much closed networks, to the outside world, with the exception of a few ports and protocols. And as we started to connect the agencies to the internet to really, take advantage of what the internet has to offer, and also, automating, services to American citizens, I think it kind of forced us to start looking at, how we can change the structure of our security architectures, which led, quite honestly, through the CNCI to develop TIC, the Trusted Internet Connections Program, which really added structure to the perimeter security defenses, and also kind of forced agencies to think about, the number of connections they had out to the internet. And so it was more about trying to reduce the attack surface. Back then, cloud wasn't as big of a hosting environment as it is today. But then as we started getting into 2010 and up through 2017 with the IT modernization report under the previous administration, the perimeter security architecture really served as a bottleneck that was interfering with our broader adoption of cloud, but also wasn't yielding the security benefits that we really need. Because we transitioned away from people trying to break through our firewalls to phishing attacks, and they're very sophisticated nation-state attacks that really require us to rethink how we're doing cybersecurity. And I think it really starts with taking a look at how we're protecting our data and our applications. And so with that said, zero trust to me is really about looking at how we can look at the data and the applications and engineer and architect from the inside out versus the build the big network and add everything to it, because that's really created some problems for us over the last few years. I just want to double down on what you said earlier, though, about this not really being a product that you can buy. Zero trust is really a philosophy, and it's its approach to cybersecurity architecture and capabilities and how they're implemented to support zero trust principles. And it's really not something we can buy and plug into the infrastructure and turn on and have zero trust right away.
And how, as you mentioned, trying to minimize the attack surface, how has the big shift to remote and telework for agencies accelerated this or impacted the importance and need of it?
That's a fantastic question. I remember back in March of 2020 when, it was March 13th, just about a year ago, we were all transitioned to remote work. And, in our conversations with a number of the very large agencies, being in the Trust Internet Connections program, agencies are really struggling with, how to support, a substantial shift in the remote workforce. And so it really caused us to take a step back. At that time, just to take it back a little bit, at that time, our TIC 3.0 guidance was still in draft, and agencies were very nervous about moving forward with that new type of security architecture paradigm. Knowing that there's FISMA oversight, there's Inspector General reports and such, and so they really looked to us to provide them with top cover. And that top cover really came in the form of interim telework guidance that we released out of the TIC program to support the functions and the features of TIC 3.0, so that agencies could leverage direct cloud use from their devices, not necessarily going through their agency VPNs. And so that's kind of what led us to learn a lot about what it's going to look like, today. And we've baked a lot of what we learned along the way into our final TIC 3.0 documentation, use cases, and capabilities.
And you talk about, mention the philosophy component of it, and certainly, despite its roots being in technology, it is really more than just a framework, and it is a larger philosophy and journey. What is the kind of culture that's required for zero trust framework to succeed? How have you seen the cultural evolution throughout, the TIC 3.0 evolution and this journey the last couple of years?
Well, I think to be honest with you, I think it's been kind of a mixed bag, because I think a lot of agency leadership at the CIO and CISO level, they really liked the top cover they had with this legacy TIC program. TIC 2.0 is what we refer to it as. And, it added the structure that they could use to help not only support their investment in security, architecture, and capability, but also to have the ability to, start to bake in more cybersecurity features on the perimeter. And so there's a number of agencies that are very, very much sticking with that type of architecture and set of capabilities. But there's also another side of the equation, and that is there are some leaders out there that have done some really phenomenal things to advance their use of cloud. They were really forced to, I think, over the last couple of years. And so I think that they've been, our advocates in terms of taking what we've done, helping us evangelize the benefits of it, because it's actually saved them a lot of money. It's provided them with better service to their users, and it's also, I think, provided better performance in terms of their use of cloud and how they're supporting agency access for the users and American citizens that access their services.
And what do you think that for those agencies, that's something that could be taught to those other agencies that are kind of still slowly, more slowly adopting or transitioning to this zero trust journey? I mean, what advice do you have for those agencies? Obviously, you just indicated some of the key benefits, cost savings, workloads, and just better mission support. How can agencies start to continue to build this culture of zero trust and cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, in federal IT, it's always been, and it's started to break down a little bit over the last 5 or so years, but it's always been kind of stovepiped in terms of, like, you have the IT organization in an agency, you have the CIO and the CISO and their teams that really do, I think, a phenomenal job in a lot of cases, keeping the networks running, keeping the applications going and as secure as they can. They're large, complex, environments. And I think that, to be honest with you, when you look at the size and complexities associated with what we had in the data centers, what we're doing in cloud, and really that hybrid hosting arrangement that we have now, I think the biggest thing is agencies having a strategy that really embraces modernization, baking zero trust principles into that modernization, having the leadership that's going to support it. And that's not just at the CIO level, but that's from the highest levels of the organization down to the users. But when we look at what it takes to really go from where we are with traditional implementation to zero trust, it takes the entire representation of the agency, the business side of the agency, the application, the data, the network, and the infrastructure teams, and making sure they can come together as a team to really look at the applications, what it's going to do when you start making changes to incorporate zero trust. Because one of the first things that we hear is that zero trust means that you don't trust the users, and it's really not about that. And that's a misconception. That's a marketing problem, I think, that we have. And it's really about making sure that the users, and that's not only the sanctioned users at the agency, but the partner users, but also, quite frankly, the adversaries that are coming in as users, that they're treated the same way in terms of there's going to be requirements to get into the applications and data, and it's conditional, and that access is going to be decremented over time so that there's a reauthentication and reauthorization. And so it's really about protecting what's important to the organization to ensure that that data and that application as assets to support the organization are kept as secure as they can, and still facilitate the important work of the agency.
And so I think that's a great example of a misconception. Are there other myths, so to speak, as conversations you've had with agencies that need to be busted as it relates to either implementing this or the strategy and framework or architecture of it as a whole?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is looking at zero trust as a long-term endeavor. It's an evolving space. Obviously, the market space is collapsing in a number of ways that's probably going to be more supportive of providing more robust integrated zero trust capabilities. That if you look at the zero trust pillars, where you can have full integration across all the pillars to support capabilities. But it's the complexities, the time, and also making sure that that the funding is there to right size the capabilities, to support what's necessary at the agencies. And the one thing that the one thing I think is also important to kind of, reiterate is that, zero trust is not like something that's a one size fits all. So you're not going to treat all your applications as a full blown, lock it down, zero trust implementation. I think there's a gradient scale that needs to be factored into this. If we look at high value assets as a class of systems and data and services within agencies, those are considered our crown jewels. And, we've got to treat them appropriately, because quite honestly, that's probably where some of the larger data repositories are. That's also where a lot of, interconnected systems between agencies, like you look at passports and what the TSA does and CVP, there's a lot of interconnections there. So we want to make sure that those systems are given the proper protections, and making sure that we have the proper visibility to ensure that we know what's going on in those systems, and when there's something that's abnormal, that we can take action as quickly as possible.
So I think that is also one of the challenges that some agencies face. It just feels like such a big problem. They don't really know where to start. So if you were looking at an agency, and as you've been working with other agencies, is there a starting point or a baseline for the journey? And I think of it always in terms of the moniker people, process, and technology. Is there a baseline of technologies that you need? Is there a baseline of people that need to be supporting this, and a baseline of you have to have some sort of policies process in place to start to execute?
Yeah, I think so. Just to pare it down a little bit, because it can be looked at as a big initiative, a big problem set to transition. And I think the biggest thing to consider is, we've got the executive order out that really lays out a few very important things with regard to zero trust. And on the heels of that, we've got the federal zero trust strategy. And looking at what OMB is trying to accomplish through the federal zero trust strategy, I think there are important steps that we can take over the course of the next couple of years to pour concrete over that initial transition to zero trust. And you can see that there's a high degree of focus on identity, looking at multi-factor authentication, collapsing the identity providers, and also phishing resistant authentication as well. So those are some things that we've been struggling with, like identity for years with PIV. And so those to me that's a very foundational thing, that the element of zero trust that really probably needs to get some attention right away, because you look at SolarWinds, you look at some of the more sophisticated attacks to include supply chain attacks. They're leveraging the authentication mechanisms and the federated authentication to go from environment to environment. We need to look at ways to not only limit that through identity, but also looking at network segmentation to reduce the ability to move laterally in the environment. And I think that's really where zero trust comes in to help shape that that problem set, because if you can focus your identity on the application and access to the data, and also allow to govern access to those assets, then I think we're really looking at how we can start to shift our thinking away from just logging into the network and the Active Directory, and then being able to do what we need to do. And so it's a fundamental shift in the way that we need to think about it. But I think the biggest thing is as John Kindervag noted as the grandfather of zero trust, he'll tell you that don't take large chunks of your environment and try and turn it into a zero trust implementation. Find opportunities to take small incremental steps to start moving there, so you can start to see some successes and show your users and your leadership that this can be done in an incremental fashion that really can help enable business, not necessarily disenfranchise users and make it harder to use, right? I think those are big important things to consider.
And is there any like best practices along those lines? And I think that makes a lot of sense and is extremely helpful and insightful. Is for agencies that have a lot of perimeter-based tools that they've invested in over the last decade, is there a best practice for them to start to phase those out to more zero trust tools or zero trust enabled tools like and around identity?
Well, I would say that, just generally speaking about, capabilities that we've invested in over the last couple of years, I think it's a matter of looking at them as things that agencies already have that can potentially be repurposed, maybe reconfigured or re-architected to support zero trust. And one big area in particular, looking at some of the things we've assessed over the years with high value assets, making sure that you can put in rudimentary network segmentation that's available on the router and switch fabric that most agencies have today, and start to look at how you can start to segment those off, limit traffic flows, to make sure that the systems that are talking in and out of those enclaves are the ones that should be, and restricting the traffic that's unnecessary.
And as I know we're getting close to our time, is for our audience that is trying this, what is the implications of not doing this?
The implications are that we're going to probably see increased nation state attacks. All we have to do is look at what's going on in the world today. I'm concerned, CISO put the Shields Up campaign out there several weeks ago. I am, as most Americans probably are concerned, but as a cybersecurity professional, I'm very concerned about what this could look like if the geopolitical situation that we're experiencing today gets worse. And so the implication is that by not moving in this direction, and this is not a short-term fix, but I think agencies are going to continue to be exposed unnecessarily, especially when we're talking about, high value assets and critical systems and services that are really, what's supporting the mission essential functions of the agencies. And so I think that's something that we've really just got to cognize. Look at SolarWinds, look at Log4j. You just don't have to look very far to see what's coming down the pipe, but certainly ransomware is a big issue that I'd be looking at right now too.
And as we wrap up here, John, is there some practical advice that you can provide our audience and that you provide agencies, just in terms of continuing to evaluate their zero trust readiness?
Yeah, so zero trust readiness, and I'll try and keep this, concise. We know that there's some pretty holistic issues in each agency, and some worse than others. But governance is a big part of this. Being able to understand what's on your network and manage it authoritatively is an area that definitely needs some consideration. But making sure you understand what's on your network in terms of assets, so you can do asset management. The CDM program is rolling out EDR. That's an area that agencies should be looking to take advantage of. But the fundamental capabilities that are offered through the CDM program are some good areas to start in.
Well, John, I can't thank you enough for, again, spending some time sharing your insights. I think we are barely just scratching the surface. The good news is it is a journey, so we need to continue to talk about it. So again, thank you for your time and informing our audience about the importance of zero trust.
Thank you very much, James. I appreciate you having me on here, and always glad to talk about zero trust.
Thank you. Now let's pivot to Cisco Secure's advisory CISO, Wolfgang Goerlich, for an in-depth presentation on how to construct a better zero trust architecture.
Yeah, thanks, James. I appreciate that introduction and that question, right? How do we build a better zero trust infrastructure? Is one that a lot of us are taking from different points of view. It's one that we're still trying to shake out in the agencies, in the industry, in the broader security community. So I'm really happy to be with you guys today to share some of the things that that I've been seeing and that I've been working on. So what is influencing this? Well, for one, it's Cisco and our move to zero trust. We had a very successful transition that enabled us to go to hybrid and now to, or rather to remote and then to hybrid work as the pandemic rolled out, adopting zero trust from a risk-based authentication approach, layering on segmentation, micro-segmentation, and really enabling that anywhere. So that experience and a lot of the lessons learned out of that has really driven many of the conversations, both in terms of advisory and coaching that I've been having, internal and external. And the other background to this is we've been doing a series of workshops, taking some of what we learned from that transition, taking a lot of the experiences of organizations that have used Cisco products and dual security to do zero trust over the past few years. We wrapped that into the series of workshops. One of them, strategy and planning, is what I lead, and that's what I'm going to walk through today and kind of highlight some of those blueprint items that you would want to be considering, that you'd want to be thinking through, the sort of like the actionable bits, right? It's a 3-hour workshop, so how can we get the actionable bits in a good half hour? We'll be talking through that today. And then alongside that, we've been doing a implement and execute workshop, which is really more the hands-on component, building these technologies, reflecting that strategy and planning, reflecting that blueprint at the technical layer, right? Taking the governance policy and baking it into the technical policy. And I think we've done probably, we're nearing 100, somewhere around 50 to 70. We're on the back half as we head up to 100 workshops. And so there's some areas where I think people do very well. And there's definitely some areas where organizations struggle. When we roll out these workshops, we're talking about principles, we're talking about architecture. So I want to highlight and hit that first. We do an assessment process and follow effectively a 5-stage model. I'm going to share that model. So as you're thinking through how to build your roadmap, if you're thinking through how to evaluate and assess your infrastructure, if you're thinking through how to apply some of the work that's coming out of CISA and the COE, how to apply that zero trust reference architecture that came out a couple of years ago in 800.207. As you're thinking through that, here's some little bit more granular considerations. And then we talk through building a roadmap section and a plan section. In that part, I want to hit on and emphasize one of the things that I was hearing in that last section, which is, what does this mean for culture? What does zero trust mean when you're trying to build strong collaborations with your peers, with your stakeholders? How does the zero trust conversation translate into zero trust implementation through good communication and through that the culture change that we're all still going through today? So I'll touch on those as well. Obviously, one of the big considerations about zero trust is there's still so much broad viewpoint on it. Oftentimes I compare what we're going through today with zero trust with what we went through maybe a decade ago with cloud. And if you remember that transition, you surely remember that in the early days of cloud, everyone had their version of the cloud. There was no standard, there's no communication. And then there's some early wins. Some organizations went first. There's some great proof points that came out. Here's the value I saw. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. And suddenly, right, every vendor was saying that their product was cloud, and they knew the way, and that created a lot of confusion. And then thankfully, everything sort of settled, and now we've got really great definitions of what SaaS means, really great definitions of what infrastructure as a service means, platform as a service. We've really sort of settled into that and moved into the build out and moved into, frankly, for many agencies, still what is going to continue to be a hybrid model. In much the same way, I think Zero Trust is going through that same transition. We had a lot of hype, a lot of excitement about it. A lot of people had a lot of different views. 802.07 came out and standardized the principles and standardized the definitions. And now we've had some organizations and agencies that have had early wins, have had successes, especially enabling remote work, especially responding to the pressures, both geopolitically and from a health and human services perspective over the past 2 years. We've had some organizations that had wins, and now we're making a lot of momentum thanks to the EO and all the other pressures to go ahead and implement this infrastructure. I'll share with you my definition, just noting that a definition is a definition, right? This is mine personal. This is not Cisco's. You probably won't find this in the numerical collateral. But what I think about when I think about Zero Trust is I think about a dynamic trust boundary, right? We're going to extend trust dynamically. That trust is going to be short-lived. It's not going to be the network segments of old. It's not going to be because a person was in a group and therefore they have access to things. It's going to be very short-lived per session, per connection. It's going to be tightly scoped. I am on my computer and I'm accessing the SaaS application. I'm on my computer. I'm opening these data files. It's going to be tight scoped to just include those resources. It's going to be enforced by policy. We're going to determine whether or not that connection should happen. We're going to make some determination as to how we're extending trust, again, through the implementation of technical policy, reflecting governance and all the things that we've decided, all the things that have come up to this point. How do we put that in technology? And it's going to be informed by trust signals and telemetry, which I'll expand on all that. But yeah, dynamic trust boundary, short-lived, tight scoped, forced by policy, and informed by trust signals and telemetry. That's my personal definition. And one of the considerations, one of the things I think drives this sort of like elephant view is, all right, where does that apply? Well, that's my definition for Zero Trust principles. And another area where oftentimes we have a lot of debate back and forth is when some people are talking about specific Zero Trust technology, like I'm going to do NAC, or I'm going to do microsegmentation, right? Or a specific capability. It's that debate that happens. This viewpoint of mine is that we start with the principles, we implement them in architecture for specific use cases. That architecture is built on with a series of capabilities, and those are not only the Zero Trust capabilities, but also our upstream and downstream security capabilities. What about our risk management function? What about our CMDBs, right? What about our CDMs? What about all that? How does that integrate in and inform Zero Trust? And if Zero Trust makes an allow or deny decision, how is that being reflected back into our logs? How are we reporting on that? How are we tracing that, right? All those capability level discussions. It's enabled, of course, with a series of technologies, as I think was said very well in the previous session. It's not a technology. Today, Zero Trust is, most organizations who are implementing this are implementing it with a series of products reflected with specific features. So I like that stack. I like that approach. I hope you do too. I hope that's helpful. I find it very useful when I'm having the conversation. Wait, let's pause. Are you talking about the architecture or the principles? Are you talking about a specific capability, or are you talking about a specific technology? Of course, the principles have been very well defined, I think, in 802.07. The application of those principles to the architectures is really where we're at in many ways as we talk through this. And so I won't reiterate it that, but it's pretty straightforward, right? I'm going to strongly authenticate a user. I'm going to strongly authenticate a device. I'm going to protect the network traffic between that user and device, the resource they're connecting to. And I'm going to use good telemetry, including behavioral attributes, including other observable states, to make sure that that connection should be passed through or not. From an architecture perspective, again, 207, I think, has a really good view of this. Forrester and Gartner have also weighed in, and there's definitely advantages to looking at multiple models. I will say one thing about the 207 architecture that is oftentimes, I mean, it's implied, I think we get it, but oftentimes can be overlooked, is because what the subject is, because the identity can vary so much. Is it our customers, our citizens? Is it other agencies? Is it part of our workforce? Um, is it human at all, right? Or is it RPA, or are we talking about service level identities? Or for that matter, in some instances, device level identities, that piece of equipment, that OT, that IoT that we need to be considering. Because we've got a number of different um, identities to consider. When we think through that the PDP and the PAP, right, the decision and enforcement points, when we think through those, what that naturally leads us to is having oftentimes multiple different policy engines. So another area where we can struggle, and another area that I think we should be prepared for going into a zero trust conversation, is the reality is near term being built with different technologies, being reflected in different architectures. Near term, many agencies and organizations are going to have multiple different policy engines. So what does that mean, right? How do we plan for that? How do we phase them in? How do we ensure consistency across those policies? I'll get to that in a moment. But as we think about this lovely reference architecture, keep in mind that you're going to need to replace or replicate it across a couple different use cases, across a couple different architecture patterns, in order to provide this concept of no implicit trust, in order to create these dynamic trust boundaries. One of my friends and colleagues has said that zero trust results in a perimeter, right, where the perimeter is defined whenever we're making an access control decision. The pros to that, and what I love about that concept, is historically with our network perimeters, and we touched on this in the last session, historically with our network perimeters, it was very limited, right? IP address limited, TCP, UDP ports. As things got a little bit better, application layer, firewall rule set, our perimeter was based on that type of model. And based wherever we could put a firewall. So it had to be infrastructure we owned, or worse, we had to route all the traffic back, right? Now I've got a number of folks who are working at home offices, and I'm routing all my traffic back and running it through a firewall in my data center to run it all the way back out to the internet to connect to SaaS applications, because that's the control point we've used. With zero trust, what we're trying to do with that architecture pattern, back to the zero trust principles, is elevated up to being wherever we have that policy enforcement and policy decision point, wherever we're making an access control decision. That can be directly on the SaaS application itself. That can be directly on the networking equipment itself. It can be directly on the resource, wherever that resource is. That creates a really great paradigm where we can spread that perimeter out over things we don't own, over things we don't control, which is oftentimes becoming more often than not with some of the shifts we've seen, right? The other thing I think is really important about this, if you're already like, yes, I've already got a lot of these components in place, I've already got some of these things done. The other thing that is important to consider about this is that crunchy outer shell, chewy inside. Historically, when we talked about that, we meant, it's very hard to get into the perimeter, but once you're in the perimeter, you're in this lovely network, you're in this lovely wide trust boundary, not tightly scoped at all, where anyone can communicate to anything. And the time, right, once you make that decision, the clock that keeps running as that session's open, once we're past that access control decision at the perimeter, there's a lot of different things that can be moved around. There's a lot of things that can happen. And of course, that is oftentimes where adversaries have been, making good use of this excessive trust. If you find yourself in a more mature zero trust organization, more further along in the path of deploying out zero trust, one of the considerations that we need to start making is, if we're making these access control decisions at the time of connection per session, back to the principles, What happens once the clock starts ticking on that session? Have we created a soft, chewy center with the applications they're connecting, with the resources they're connecting to? One of the leading edges of Zero Trust today is that concept of continuous risk assessment, where we're checking on a more periodic basis. Not continuous like, oh, every quarter I'm reviewing it. I mean, continuous like to the hour, maybe to the minute, where we're checking those signals. And when something changes, we're able to take action. So as more of an advanced concept, think about that side of things if you're already got some of these controls in place. Otherwise, we're going to have that crunchy outside, chewy inside all over again, just at a different layer. All right, I mentioned policy at a governance layer and policy at a technical layer. Where to start? If you're just starting out, where to start? Getting a position paper in place, reviewing and implementing guidelines, starting to develop standards for new systems and projects for existing systems to apply these principles and these architectures. As they get applied, putting in place system-specific policies, and definitely having this as a reference architecture. I think it's going to be incredibly important that we have a reference architecture that things are plugging into, that we've got everyone on the same page as we move forward. Otherwise, what can happen is with multiple different implementations of Zero Trust, not having them aligned, creating silos, and doing a lot of the same confusion that we've felt with other policies, that we felt with other shifts, getting back to the cloud shift, right? Now we've got 6 different cloud instances. How do you rationalize that? We know that this is a natural progression of any technology, so let's start with the rationalization up front. From a Cisco perspective, we tend to slice and dice Zero Trust up by 3 broad use cases. For equipment in the workplace, IT, IoT, OT, for our application workloads, specifically important when we're working with application teams that are building out apps, the DevOps environments, the Agile environments. We've got services that we need to protect those workloads within the application ecosystem. And then Zero Trust for the workforce, right? Employees, contractors, those sort of folks who are accessing their applications. Those are the 3 broad use cases from a very broad roadmap, and I'll cover this, and then I'm going to do a deep dive on the workforce side of things to give you an example. But as I give this deep dive in the workforce, I would encourage you to shift up and think about these same type of things that I'm going to highlight in the application workload concepts in the environment, right? We start off by trying to verify what we have and getting good visibility into it. We do discovery to build the context. And with that context, we start to enforce and apply policies. And then we optimize and plug the Zero Trust architecture into the broader architecture and make sure that it is a pattern that can be repeated and can be maintained. That's a very large, high-level roadmap. Now I'm going to deep dive in the workforce. Again, I would encourage you as I do this, though, to tie it back to workload and workplace if those are the domains that you're going to be working on. I tend to find that a lot of organizations start with the workforce. It's a easier uplift, especially with the focus on remote work and hybrid work. It's one that has garnered a lot of attention in terms of providing visibility and whatnot. So let's walk through those stages and I'll tie it out. You start with verifying the user trust. One of the things we talk about in the workshops that I give is how do we verify that, right? One of the things that we say is, well, with different factors of authentication, we can have different degrees of trust. And those factors can be incredibly weak, all the way down to a shared password, or incredibly strong with biometrics and CAC cards and the whole passwordless conversation. But of course, we immediately, once we're like, oh, I'll just dial everything up to 9, right? I'll just dial it all the way to the top and I won't have to worry about it. We immediately run into a couple caveats. From a culture perspective or from a workforce perspective, perhaps not all of those are accepted. Not all of those are possible. We may have, contingent workers. We may have, different rules that govern what can be provided out to the workforce. And then on the application side, not all applications are going to support all factors, all workflows. Not all applications, will support the SAML protocols, the OAuth OIDC protocols. On the passwordless side, the FIDO2, WebAuthn, and CTAP protocols. Not all applications today even support the basics, let alone moving to zero trust. So one of the early exercises in this stage is to map out what is acceptable to your various user contingencies, to map out what is feasible to your various application environments, and then drive change from that lens. All right, so once we've got some control, a key aspect of zero trust is observability, is the visibility. Where does that visibility come from? It comes from wherever we've got that policy enforcement in place. From the workforce perspective side, we're using that multi-factor, that risk-based authentication perspective as a place that we've got that policy in place. So what does that mean? That means anywhere that I went through the exercise and started deploying out multi-factor, anywhere I've got visibility into whatever devices are attaching. Now, there's a really good point to be made of, all right, if I've got visibility into all my devices, great, that's good. I can start doing things with that. What about all my applications? So for that type of conversation, we need to have devices that have CASB or have something else out that are also building that dynamic application inventory. So we need a dynamic application inventory and we need a dynamic device inventory. And both of those can be driven from various points within the system. So the next conversation at this level is stage 2, right? Now that we've got some good controls, is where do we go next? Where do we go to apply that multi-factor out? Where do we go to apply single sign-on? Where do we go to make sure, back to zero trust principles and tenets, that the network communication is protected, is encrypted, be that either through a VPN or through a borderless approach? Where do we go and how do we stack those applications out? There can be a really great transition plan to communicate and figure out what that is. I'm working with one organization. They've got around 10,000 different applications. So the conversation becomes, how do we prioritize our apps? Where are we going to act? Because we're not going to be able to move all 10,000 in a month, right? And at Cisco, we started off with 20 and we moved very quickly to 100 within 6 months. So just to give you a sense, and that was, of course, global with a pretty big footprint. So those applications that we're moving, we need to document them, have some really good conversations, be it with the owners of the SaaS apps or with the on-premise apps. And again, here's 2, we can run into some challenges. So do we have a good application inventory? Do we know who owns the application? Is the owner engaged? Do they have the tech staff necessary to make some of these changes to put zero trust policy enforcement in front of their applications? There's can be a lot of conversations that need to go on. And if you do have thousands to 10,000 of applications, having a meeting just with every owner can take up a significant amount of time. So another way to slice and dice this is to really look for ways that we can consolidate those workflows, that we can consolidate the access methods. It could be simply we're going to move everything that's on this single sign-on portal over, right? It could be something similar to that. We know everything that's currently in our SSO needs to be moved. We can start at that point. So have some consideration on that side. How can we collapse down the application conversations to make that go quicker? All right, so if step 1 is all about coverage for people, step 2 is all about coverage for applications, step 3 is all about coverage for our devices. As we know, this graph comes from the dual trusted access report. As we know, there's been an incredible increase in non-Windows devices in the fleet. So have a view into that composition. And very similar to what we did with the applications, we're going to take a look at those device classifications. And again, take a look at the risk ranking of our applications and figure out which devices should be able to access what applications. When we get visibility into the devices, it's not uncommon that we find that there's a lot of devices that we didn't account for. Either they weren't properly connected to the CMDB, or they've been introduced in the application ecosystem or the device ecosystem through BYOD or other things. Right? There needs to be some cleanup on that side. And of course, not every device should be able to contact every resource. If we've got a situation where we've got, for example, privileged IT, We've got privileged IT administrators. They are doing, privileged access management, and we only want them to come in off of a privileged access workstation. All right, so we've got our PAWS talking to our PAM through our ZT, and doing that, we want to make sure that the ZT policy is saying, yep, only that device can connect, no other devices can. And oh, by the way, we're also going to look at some additional things about that device before we allow them to connect, that context and conditions component. So in this stage, we really need to do some risk ranking of the applications and apply that risk ranking to the devices. Some of that work should have already been done, right? We already should have some ideas to what the prioritization and the tiering of the applications are. So we want to be able to pull that information in, use some of that existing work that's been done over the past several years on the risk management side of things and reflect it within the Zero Trust roadmap. So start off with stage 1 with coverage for users, stage 2 with coverage for applications and activities, stage 3 with coverage for the devices that are going to be within them. And again, I think there can be some really good transition to, we're going to do something comparable within the application workloads, right? What are those workloads? What are the identities? And what are the containers or virtual machines, or even in some cases some of that legacy hardware that's still in play, and how do we get coverage on that? Once we have that reflected, once we've colored in within that Zero Trust architecture, we color in some of those pieces and have filled some of that in, that's where we can really step up and go into enforcing the adaptive policy. Keeping in mind that is what Zero Trust is about, right? We're enforcing policy to determine whether or not we trust this particular access request before we're going to allow it to connect into our environment. Now, what those policies are going to vary. Again, this is from the Duo Trusted Access Reports. These are some of the top policies that we use. What environment they're coming in from in terms of network restrictions. Are the devices themselves up to date? Are they patched? They're well maintained? Is the security hygiene correct? A more advanced slice of that is the device free from malware? Let's make sure that it's not infected with anything before we allow it to connect. Does the device meet certain criteria, like having a firewall, having the AV on, having disk encryption, right? All those types of conversations can be had. Now, at this stage in the game, we may want to plan in the roadmap to move a little bit slowly, right? We're going to consider the policy. We're going to do some assessment first. We're not just going to flip something on and suddenly have a portion of the workforce that can't connect because no one's asked them if they had their software up to date in a while. I'm sure that's not the case, but you see my point. We want to make sure that when we start rolling out these policies that it's methodical, it's well thought through, and we look at ways that things might break before they do. Part of this part of building the roadmap in terms of a metrics perspective is when we build out our Zero Trust infrastructure, looking at it from a coverage perspective first, so that we can color in within the Zero Trust architecture the right components, and then looking at it from a depth perspective. What is the depth our policies will allow us to go to, and how can we roll those out in a meaningful way? When we do all that, we start getting to that final stage of Zero Trust, that fifth stage where we're optimizing. What can oftentimes happen is that there'll be several iterations, right? Small targeted initiatives that move specific use cases, specific components into Zero Trust. And by use cases, I mentioned the top level ones about devices and workloads, the equipment in the workplace and the workforce. Within that, it could be even more granular. Within the workforce, I'm going to just move my remote users. I'm just going to tackle privileged users, those sort of things. It's very important, back to the beginning where I mentioned architecture patterns, to at this stage, make sure that we're plugging those things into a very consistent reference architecture, and that it's lining up with our governance models and everything else to avoid having any sort of siloed effects, right? Zero trust will be that long-term endeavor, as was said earlier, and our understanding is evolving through the COE, through CISO's zero trust maturity model. The technologies are evolving through risk-based authentication, through NAC and microsegmentation, through VPN and tunneling and micro-tunneling. So we've got to be careful that as we're moving pieces up, they continue to reflect those original tenets of zero trust and are supported. When we look at the roadmap side of these things and start, assessing where we're at and planning what to do next, there are some barriers to watch out for. Very broad execution plans can struggle, can fail to show any progress over a quick time. Not having sponsorship and partnerships with IT, with the application owners, those areas can create a lot of tension. We can have technical challenges like technical debt, where I think the current strategy is predominantly like segment and isolating. Similarly with legacy systems, we can have legacy IT ways of reaching out to systems that are not going to work, where we don't have that direct connection anymore. So when breaking the barriers, when putting in place zero trust to provide better mission support, a lot of it has to be done culturally. At Cisco, we're working on a new slice of the security outcome study, specifically around zero trust. And one of the things that I found very interesting out of that data was executive support, peer collaboration and partnership, security culture, those three areas. Organizations that were reporting success with zero trust similarly reported they had very high degrees of those areas. So that is a good place to start and firm up, as well as that's a great area to revisit as you're doing a zero trust initiative. I'd encourage you to think through this from an architectural perspective, as well as from a digital transformation perspective. At Cisco, the way we did this was we had a core team of architects reflecting those stages I mentioned about, reflecting the people, reflecting the devices, reflecting the applications, reflecting the integration with other security capabilities. And we drove it from that architecture perspective. And once we had that pattern in place, it became very repeatable and very easy to move other applications and resources in. All right, I'm just about up on time. Just a really couple final thoughts. I'm very excited about zero trust. I have always been. I think it's building on things we've wanted to do for many, many years and are finally getting able to do it. So I would encourage you to look at CISO and the work that's being done there. Look at the COE, partner with your vendors. In this talk, I mentioned the strategy and planning workshops that I lead. I'm sure there's other opportunities with other vendors in your ecosystem to do something comparable. So I'd encourage you to reach out to them. And as you're putting together this blueprint, get the basic building blocks in place, figure out where the reference architecture applies, color it in, sequence your workflows and use cases, and do that through a series of very specific initiatives for zero trust. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, James.
Thanks for that, Wolfgang. Before you leave this afternoon, I wanted to highlight an initiative that Presidio Federal has been working on. The Presidio Federal Center of Excellence is designed as a space for leadership, best practices, research, support, and/or training for an area of focus. This happens in a virtual environment, and initially the two areas of focus are on cybersecurity and collaboration. It is designed to support government agencies as they navigate unprecedented challenges and timelines to modernize. The more users interact with the content, the more AI technology allows additional content to be made available in the user's area of interest. You can browse, store, comment, and share useful information with others in your network. At any time, you can also connect with a representative who can further address your specific needs. There is a link to the space in the resources bar of this event for you all to check out. Here at the end of our program, I want to take the time to thank John Sims from CISO once more and Wolfgang Goerlich for joining us and sharing their expertise. I'd also like to thank Cisco and Presidio Federal for making this event possible. Finally, thank you, our audience, for tuning in to today's program. We hope you learned a thing or two and will be able to take a few tricks back to strengthen your cybersecurity environment. From GovExec, I'm James Hansen. See you next time.